Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 10 video. Today I'll be talking about 10 things you may be doing wrong in TFT, both in general and for patch 1024. We'll cover topics such as leveling, rolling, and more that both beginner and some veteran players should keep in mind when playing. With all that said, let's jump on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. To kick things off, let's begin with the number 10 thing you may be doing wrong, which is not transitioning towards 5-cost champions in the late game. While the strength of 5-cost champions can vary depending on balance, it's pretty clear that in set 4, you're almost always going to have at least 2 or 3 champions that you can lean on for the late game. For patch 1024, it looks like the top legendary champions to play are Yone, Kayn, and Zilean, but practically every late game champion can be useful depending on your comp. It can be difficult to judge when you should be playing these champions, especially if you have a specific composition that may not have room for them. Trying to go for 9 cultists, for example, means you can really only fit in Zilean. But if you're playing any composition that has wiggle room at level 8 and 9, it's going to be a huge boon to your board if you pick up and play a few 5-cost champions. Generally, the flow of the game goes like this. Early game is 1 and 2 cost champions, mid game is all about 3 costs with a touch of 4, and late game is 4 costs with a heavy emphasis on 5-cost champions. So when you're getting late into the game and wondering why you're only getting top 4 placements and not top 2, it's quite possibly due to not transitioning properly into that late game. Of course, it's worth keeping in mind that you won't always be able to find and 2-star every legendary champion late game, but being aware of the potential power spike they provide is going to help out quite a bit in consistently placing higher in your games. Let's move on to the number 9 thing that you may be doing wrong, which is passing too many chosen champions. So this can happen at any stage of the game when you're presented a chosen in your shop and you don't buy it. Sure, there are times that this is the right choice, especially if you're doing a roll down later on in the game and you don't want a 2-cost chosen, but oftentimes players will roll and ignore perfectly good chosens. This happens to all types of players, whether you're new to the game or a veteran. Now, we're not saying you should always buy the chosen champions that appear in your shop. It is an active decision that needs to be made, and at times the correct choice is not to buy them. Specifically if you don't have economy to invest into it, or it simply doesn't fit with anything that you're currently running. But there is a good amount of times where you should buy the champion simply to give yourself an immediate power spike. For example, if it's early on in the game and you're presented with an okay 2-cost champion, like say Annie or Vi, would you buy those? A lot of times players will ignore them because they aren't the best champions under normal circumstances. But a 2-cost chosen, especially during stage 2 and 3, can impact your board in a huge way. It's perfectly okay to buy those champions, play them for a few rounds to stabilize or start win streaking, and then sell them later. It's also extremely common later on in the game with 3 and 4-cost champions. Players will roll looking for the perfect champion to buy as a chosen and ignore several perfectly acceptable choices. Then they're all of a sudden at 0 gold and have no chosen. If they instead bought one of the chosens, they'd be in a much better position to stabilize their board and economy. Try to keep this in mind when you're presented with a chosen in your shop and think it's not worthwhile to buy. Next up is the number 8 thing you're doing wrong, which is not leveling enough. Okay, this may be a bit vague, but it's an issue that is really presenting itself in patch 1024. Prior to this patch for set 4, you could easily get away with bypassing most of the early stages and just aim to roll down at level 7 on 4-1 and be fine. But with damage changes and the chosen shop chances being changed, it's going to be much more beneficial to level earlier and more often, even if it hurts your economy a bit. What all this means is you now want to aim to be level 4, 5, and 6 by standard timings, if not earlier. Level 4, for example, can be done as early as the last round of stage 1. In that case, you'll be pre-leveling to 4 before 2-1 starts, and thus, you have a chance of finding a higher cost champion. Level 5 is the largest culprit for players not leveling, as it was common to wait until Krugs or after Krugs to go 5 if you were wanting to build up your economy and be on a loss streak. While the damage changes won't factor in at that point of the game, once you're into stage 3, you will definitely feel the health loss, and being behind in levels is going to hurt a lot. All in all, there are times you may want to delay leveling, and that's fine, but on average, it's a good idea to get into the habit of staying on a good leveling curve and keep up with the rest of your lobby. The next 2 things kind of go hand in hand, but they are different enough to warrant separate discussions. First is that you may be rolling at wrong times, which comes in at number 7. What we're talking about here is when you're rolling with no real benefit to doing so. This can be really at any stage of the game, though you're unlikely to be rolling before 6, which you really shouldn't do unless you're slow rolling for 1-cost champions. But once you're level 6 and above, there are times where you should roll, and a lot of times where you shouldn't. With the shop and chosen changes in 1024, it's worth knowing what you're potentially going to be rolling at each level. On top of that, it's important to keep in mind what you're even rolling for, as it's a common mistake for players to just roll for the sake of rolling with no real reason. They'll just have a vague idea of, oh, I need to find a chosen champion or something along those lines. To bring all of this together, don't roll when you're not going to gain any real benefit. Pay attention to what the shop chances are for regular champions and chosen champions, and be aware of what you may be able to upgrade on your board. As we said, the number 6 thing you may be doing wrong is along the same lines as you're probably rolling down too much at level 7. In patch 1024, they've changed the chances of finding chosen champions depending on what level you are. Level 7 now has a much lower chance of hitting a 4-cost chosen champion, but you may still find yourself doing it. We understand though, because it's a habit that we've fallen into as the roll at level 7 mentality has presented for all of set 4. But now with the changes they've introduced, you definitely need to be more cognizant of the fact that rolling your gold at 7 is not really going to be a payoff in the way that it previously was. That said, it is okay to roll some of your gold at level 7, as 3-cost chosen champions are still valuable, and you may occasionally high roll a 4-cost chosen. Up next is a common mistake a lot of players make. The number 5 mistake players make is not prioritizing their health enough, especially in the early game. The idea of preserving health has been an important concept for TFT since set 1, but it's still, to this day, one of the most overlooked factors in the game. This is especially true with set 4, as the mentality of ignoring the early stages of the game and rolling at 7 really threw off having to pay attention to your health early on in the game. It didn't matter if you were at 80 health or 30 health as long as you hit level 7 and found a good chosen to play. But in 1024, that's no longer the case, as your health matters a lot more throughout the whole game. In particular, you need to be aware of how weak your board is during stage 3 and 4, as the damage you take then is likely going to determine where you place at the end of the game. So what you should keep in mind is a few things. Play your strongest board even if you're trying to lose streak, because you still want to lose the least amount of health. Second is to level at least on the same curve as the rest of the lobby, so you're not behind in both board strength and rolling higher cost champions. Lastly, pay more attention to positioning, as that can really help mitigate damage even in the earlier rounds. Keeping with a similar theme, the number 4 mistake players make is they hold onto components too long. You've likely heard high ELO players say this, but it's worth repeating that you should definitely be making items when you can. Holding onto components to make the perfect item is not worth it when you're sitting on 3 or 4 components that can potentially increase your board strength by a large amount. This generally happens the most early on in the game, where players have 4 components and don't use them. Even if it's slightly subpar items, you should make at least 1, as that can be enough to swing a fight in your favor. If you're unsure about what to make, then watch some streams or read some guides on how players approach the early game and see what common items are made. Really, it doesn't matter too much what you make. Just use your components, and if it doesn't work out well for you, you'll know in the future to try something different. Alright, next up we have the number 3 thing that you may be doing wrong, which is not paying attention to who you've played against. Now, this can be a bit of an advanced concept for new players if we get into the technical details of keeping track of who you've played and how this affects your next opponent. But the easy to digest piece of advice is simply pay attention to your most recent opponents and scout out the other players afterwards. Later on in the game, this can vary, but early, when all 8 players are alive, you will not play against the same player twice, so use that to your advantage and check other boards to see if there's any positioning changes that you should make. The concept goes much deeper, but you'll eventually learn the rules of it if you're a newer player. For now, and this applies to newer and veteran players, just keep track of your most recent opponents and use that information to your advantage. It's easy to get lazy and not bother with it or scouting, but combining both of those is easy to do and will improve how well you do. Moving along, we have the number 2 mistake that players make, which is not utilizing ZZ Rot Portal effectively. Ever since ZZ Rot Portal was given a taunt, it's been a top tier item in the meta. It's easily one of the best utility items in the game because having a taunt helps you control the flow of a fight right at the beginning. But a lot of players either don't realize how effective this item can be, or simply don't bother with trying it out in different ways. A lot of time it's just thrown on a frontline champion, and that's it. And that can be good, but it's only scratching the surface. One of the best ways to use it, and you will see high ELO players doing this, is using it on the 2nd or 3rd row champion to try to catch assassins jumping out of their backline. Another way to use it is to manipulate the movement of the enemy team's frontline or melee champions by positioning the champion with it slightly away from the rest of your team, even one row back from the frontline. Really, there's a ton of ways to utilize ZZ Rot, so we encourage you to try and test out different uses of it instead of just placing it on a frontliner and forgetting about it. And the number one mistake that players make is not checking patch notes. This is likely one of the most common mistakes in TFT and most competitive games, but players just don't pay attention to or ignore patch notes. Patch notes may not always have that big of an impact on the game, but knowing what's changed is very useful information to have. In fact, if you read the patch notes on patch day and use that knowledge in your games, you're probably going to do better than normal simply because other players haven't checked what was changed. So make sure you're checking patch notes on patch days before playing. That is going to be it for today's video, folks. There's always ways to improve in a game like TFT, and even minor mistakes can have a huge impact on the game. Learning how to identify and fix those mistakes can be a great way to get better and climb higher in rank. Let us know in the comments section below if there's any other mistakes that players make that you've noticed. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.